Welcome to My Life, episode 97. To begin with, this week is Chof Dalet Teves, the Yortzeit of the Alter Rebbe. So let's say a few words about that, and as well as Parsha Vaeirah, both timely elements in our lives. The Alter Rebbe was nostalgic, Mitzvah Shabbos, Kodesh, Parsha Shmeis, Oir le Yom Aleph of Parsha Vaeirah. So, as the Rebbe explains in the various places, Likutei Sichos Chelik Tazayin, volume 16, among other places, the significance of both those elements being both Mitzvah Shabbos Shmeis, as well as, in other words, an extension of Shmeis and the beginning of Vaeirah, which is the words of the Tzemach Tzedek when he describes that sad moment. I've discussed different things about that period in time. Last year, Chof Dalet Teves, and 2 years ago, Chof Dalet Teves. When actually we launched MyLife, Chassidus Applied. So this will be coming close to the second anniversary, a little more time, but we're close to it. And I'll try to share something that has not been shared before, at least in this platform. So there's much to say about the Alter Rebbe. Of course, Rabbeinu HaGodel, in the words, the Neshama Chadosha, as the Frierdiker Rebbe identifies him as a new soul who came and introduced a new approach. New, as we all know, doesn't mean new that it wasn't existent before, but new means that it was never revealed before. Because kol ma shetalmid v'asek oseh lechadesh, anything that any good student presents, even if it's an innovation, nitn l'Moshe was given to Moses at Sinai, however there may have been concealed. So there's no such thing as new Torah. It's all coming from that which is there, but no one till the Alter Rebbe revealed it quite in that fashion. So though the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, it's Sefarim and Pisefrim, which means he took it from books and from scribes, and the different books that he's alluding to, some say the Shalah and the Maharal Meprag, or other Sefarim and Sefrim, as the Rebbe said, Purim Tov Shemem Gimel, in the Fabring, and this is the Alter Rebbe speaking in a form of humility, as if Tanya is a collection of an adaptation, when it's really full of new stuff and new material. So I want to talk about a few of the chidushim of the Alter Rebbe, especially in context of MyLife, Chassidus Applied. Because of course it all begins with Chassidus. So in the different sichos it says sometimes that the Baal Shem Tov taught that every Jew could serve God, and the Alter Rebbe taught how every Jew can serve God. So the Baal Shem Tov created the ladder, built the ladder, and the Alter Rebbe taught us how to climb up the ladder, is sometimes the way it's put. Now, does that mean how do they serve God before the Baal Shem Tov, the Alter Rebbe? So it's obvious that number one, that things that may have been obvious before and not spelled out, people just simply knew it by osmosis, now had to be addressed, especially as we were entering into the modern world and the new darkness, the new challenges. So when you say the Baal Shem Tov taught how each person can serve, which means that no matter what situation we're in, even in a time of assimilation, even a time when Yisrael, Jews, are in a state of hisalfus, which is a comatose, psychological and spiritually comatose state, and the world is in that type of state, we can also connect. And the Alter Rebbe taught how, is simply developing a comprehensive system, which is called Chassidus Chabad, and the details of how to climb that ladder and how to connect. But in getting into more details, how did he do that? How? So firstly, of course, Tanya itself is based, as the Alter Rebbe writes in the Sharblat, on his cover page, which was written by the Alter Rebbe himself. He writes that as he comes to explain, Levayed Heitev, the pasuk Korav Elecha Hadover Me'ed Beficha B'Lvavcha La'asesei. It's a pasuk at the end of Parsha Nitzavim, Moshe Rabbeinu speaking to the Jewish people in the last days of his life, and he says that Korav Elecha Hadover Me'ed Beficha B'Lvavcha La'asesei. The Alter Rebbe says the Sefer is coming, Levayed Eich Hu Korav Me'ed. How is it Korav? Beficha B'Lvavcha La'asesei. Both in our mouths, in our speech, in our hearts, and in our actions. In a long and short way, with God's help. So this line obviously carries so much power because it tells you this is the whole theme of Likutei Morim of Tanya. And Tanya being Teresh V'Ksav of Chassidus, which is the written Torah of Chassidus, therefore it tells you that Korav Elecha is really the theme of all of Chassidus, which is explaining the Teresh V'Ksav, the written Torah of Chassidus. So what does this verse say, and what is the Alter Rebbe coming to teach us with this verse? That without the Alter Rebbe, without Tanya, we wouldn't know. So let's get back to the verse. The verse is talking, Moshe Rabbeinu speaking, as I said, in his last words to the Eden, to the Jews in Sefer Dvarim, Mishnah Torah. And he's saying there that you may think that the Torah, mitzvah, tshuva, the different ways it's explained, mitzvah hazes may be distant, or b'shamayim in heaven, or across the wide seas. He says no. Lei b'shamayim hi, lei recheki hi, lei me'ever layam, ki korev elacha dover me'ed. So it's a contrast of distance, or across the sea, or in heaven. He's korev. So what does the word korev mean? The simple English translation would be close. I was once teaching Tanya in school here, and I had the opportunity, because I was working the sichos, to ask the Rebbe, and I asked the Rebbe the following question. I wrote, can we translate korev not just as close, which is really begs the question, what does it mean close? As opposed to like a mile away, it's an inch away. A Sefer Torah or Torah is right near you. Obviously close means more than just physical proximity and space. So I asked the Rebbe, can you translate korev as relevant? That it's relevant to you. And the Rebbe circled with a check and said yes. Didn't write yes, he wrote with a check. So I go with that type of achrayus. I could say that the word relevant obviously opens up a whole new way of looking at it. That Moshe Rabbeinu was coming to explain and preempt that one may say that this journey called Judaism, this journey called having a relationship with God, this journey called V'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem, serving God, can be distant, can be inaccessible, can be irrelevant, meaning either too distant, too lofty, too abstract, or something that we cannot relate to. So he said, no. It's actually relevant to you. Elecha. And Elecha is not just referring to you, to the Jews that were then in the Midbar, but Torah is nitzchis, it's eternal to every you that will ever come in history. It's relevant to you. In your life, where you are. You don't have to climb a ladder to go into heaven. You don't have to cross wide sea. It's not distant in the context of inaccessible or however else you want to translate distant. It's relevant to your life, to your personal life. So that's what the Baal Shem Tov said. The Moshe Rabbeinu states that. But how is it relevant? Eichu korev. As I said, the Baal Shem Tov taught that everyone can serve, in a sense like what Moshe is saying. But how? Because the question was answered that yes, it's relevant. But now we still need to know how to make it relevant. And here comes the Sefer HaTanya to explain that. So that's not a revolutionary or radical contribution, especially in our times where everyone has that question. Whether a person grew up in a Shemer Torah Mitzvah's home, was blessed to have a good Jewish chinuch. Many times you get trapped in the trap of Mitzvah Sanoshim Alamada, which means mechanical Judaism, robotic. It's a program, you follow, you conform. Not necessarily you will say it's relevant. Many people do many things because that's the culture in which they grew up in. Is it relevant to you? Standing on your own, if nobody was taught, no one was pressuring you, and there was no one demanding anything of you, would you find it relevant to you? So that's an Aveda. You could have the whole Torah mitzvahs and still not necessarily feel karev elach. And then, of course, the majority of the Jewish people today, many who did not have the opportunity to have the education, the Jewish education, to even know what Torah mitzvahs is, for sure, many of them question its relevance. And they find relevance in other areas, simply out of ignorance or simply because they were never taught how this can relate, and not just relate, but relate in an indispensable way. In the Sikha of, I believe it is Vaeirah, Tov Shin Lamed Aleph, the Rebbe said that the Rubik, most Jews today, which means children that are held hostage or in captivity among other alien forces, and the Rebbe says either physically alien forces means growing up in a secular world, or the alien force which is called the Yetzer Hara. Now, when you read the Sikha, you could say to yourself, 1 second, Jews all throughout history, since after Chet Tzadas, we have a Yetzer Hara. Yetzer Leva Adam Ramenu Urav in Parsha Noach goes back to the beginning of time. We were always held hostage by it. And yet, the Rebbe is saying that in our time, it seems to be that we are more Tinnik Shanish, but we don't say that about earlier generations. Because today, we are living in a world with the Yetzer Hara is far easier for it to control our lives, because many of us, even growing up, so-called in a religious environment, still are faced with challenges that our ancestors did not have. And those challenges are of a large world out there with many different options. Now, you can explain this many different ways, but the bottom line is that the Alter Rebbe came to teach. Now, when you say how, so how did he teach it to us? So, of course, here is not the place in one sitting to go through every aspect of Tanya and every aspect of Chassidus Chabad. So I want to touch upon 2-3 points in honor of Dalet Teves, how the Alter Rebbe taught Chorev Elech. So in Tanya itself, let's start. Until chapter, it's like 2 sections where we call it the beginning, the Derech Arucha Ktsara, there's the Derech Ktsara V'Arucha, as it's sometimes known. There's the approach of Meir Shalat Al-Alev, and the Alter Rebbe teaches in Perik Yud Beis in Tanya, and to sum it up, that we have inherently the ability, self-control is an inherent ability in human beings. Why is that so critical? Because if it wasn't inherent, you could always argue that the Yetzer Leva Adam, that the temptations that is innate in us, is more powerful, because we always know an acquired skill is weaker than an innate one. So if we by nature is Yetzer Leva Adam Raminu Urav, meaning that we are innately selfish and can be selfish people, so then, and self-control, Meir Shalat Alev, is not innate, is not Metevet Tel Das, as he says in chapter 12 in Tanya, which means from our birth and innate. How can an acquired power really ultimately repress and control and harness a innate one? So the Alter Rebbe comes and preempts Freudian and so much of psychology today that says we are not essentially animals. The id was the essence of a Jew is essentially the spark, the yid. That when you really cut into the unconscious and the subconscious, into the superconscious, you find the spark that is the most dominant force of all. And therefore, actually I jumped already to the second point, but let me just continue with Meir Shalat Alev. And ultimately, self-control is not some type of acquired skill like a superego or an ego, but it's part of who we are, our makeup, and therefore we could suppress, repress, and control and harness our desires and our temptations. Then comes the second part in Perik Yud Ches and on, where he starts talking about the Avemus Teres that every Jew has in him, like a spark, a divine spark, like I just said, the Yid. So combine that with the natural spark that we all have, that hidden love, that hidden connection, plus that we have the natural capacity of self-control. There you have yourself one of the fundamental principles of Chassidus Chabad that allows us to have the cognitive, the emotional, and the behavioral conditioning necessary to live a life up to the highest standards. It still requires work, but then at least you have the tools. And the Alter Rebbe is teaching us how to access those tools. That's one point I want to make. Another point is later in Ageres HaKedesh, Siman Chof, which actually was written very shortly before the Alter Rebbe's passing, as the Tzemach Tzedek writes. There are major chidushim, and I want to just mention 2 right here. Number 1, he explains there's something which is not really fully appreciated by people to the extent of the chidush, and it's interesting that he made that point at the end of Chaim Chayuse Ba'al Medain in this world, is that the Yesh HaNivra is rooted in the Yesh HaMiti. What that means is what? That the ego, that sense of Yesh, that we feel that we have no beginning, we have no ila v'siba, we have no cause that shaped us, that defined us, that created us, and that's our sense. Even though logic may state that you have something that brought you here, but our sense is that we have no feeling. Where can that come from? Only from an entity that has actually no source, and that is Atzmus, the essence of the core essence of the divine. That mitziyusim atzmuse, his existence is self-generated, so to speak, and therefore it has no ila v'siba in truth, and therefore he can imbue in us that sense. So for us, it's not a real feeling, because the fact is we do have a source, which is God. But the fact that we can feel that way coming from that place. Now you can make the argument, which probably was the argument up till that point that the Alter Rebbe wrote, that sense of self, that I'm a self-made person, is actually the root of all evil. And it should be done, we should do everything possible to stamp that out. Comes the Alter Rebbe says, no, the etzem thing, the mere fact that we have that type of feeling tells us that it's coming from the core essence of Atzmus. And of course our work is to channel that feeling and recognize that it's one and it's coming from that place. That itself is a divine attribute, so to speak, that has been instilled within us. That has also dramatic implications in the context of not just that we sublimate our egos and we sublimate ourselves, our individual self, but we learn to harness it to be that itself becomes a force of the divine self, the divine identity. So it's not just a becoming ayin and bittul, but it's ultimately also revealing that the yesh of this world is really rooted in the yesh of the highest, ultimate yesh, of course, from one extreme to the next. And finally, in Samach Vov, the classic Hemshech Tafshrei Samach Vov, from the Rebbe Rashab, in the Maimer Vaeirah, Shalach, there's, of course, he brings there the Chiddush of the Alter Rebbe, Be'inyan ha'oir. Be'inyan ha'oir. Now, briefly, the dilemma by the Kabbalists and all thinkers has always been, how can we ultimately create a bridge, an interface between the divine and existence, when they're so radically and diametrically opposed? Creator and creature, Mitzias Bilta, Mitzias Nimtza, meaning an existential existence defined by its parameters, and a non-existential existence that really means that God does not exist, but you can't say he exists the way we understand existence. And all the other infinite differences between, of course, the Vaeirah and the Nivra, and that which is even beyond the Vaeirah, even beyond the Creator, the divine. So the Kabbalists, and as he explains in Vaeirah, based on Maimonim from the Alter Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, in Eila Teireh in Yonim today, it's published, explains that the Kabbalists, therefore, came to either two schools of thought. One is you either don't fully connect to the real core of the divine because it's completely beyond us. So we do connect to a dimension of the divine, but more of a reflection, so to speak. Or we connect with the core of the divine, but we don't remain independent entities because they both can't coexist. So something has to give, something has to be compromised. Comes the Alter Rebbe b'chidush inyan ha'er and says, as opposed to the Ramak and the Rameh, whether Keser, whether Ratzon is the highest level or not, he says there's another thing called a field of energy called Eir that exists and does not exist at the same time. In other places, in Ayin Beis, in other places, he actually says Nimtza v'lei Nimtza. Sometimes that's the expression, which means that it is completely sublimated in the divine, and as a result, takes the Bilti Mitzias Nimtza, the non-existential dimension of the undefined divine, and puts it into a form of definition and existence that somewhat we can relate to. And that's the place where the two can meet. Because on one hand, because of its complete bittul and sublimation into the source, it is like the source, not because of its own merit, but because of its being sublimated in the source. And on the other hand, it's not the source because it's already some form of identity, in the most subtle of forms, that ultimately allows us to have a handle. Therefore, it's a place where the non-existential meets the existential. The non-existential existence of the divine meets the existential. More can be said about this. If anybody wants more on this, I've written about it in articles on our website. You can check it out at meaningfullife.com. And as well as even in my book, Torah Meaningful Life, in the chapter on God, I discuss this a little more in detail. But all this coming to demonstrate that the Chof Dalet Teves, the Stalkus that the Alter Rebbe brings from Megeres HaKedesh Simon Chof Ches, that on that day, everything that the Aveda, all the work and all the Torah and all the teachings of the Alter Rebbe are Eile, are elevate up to their source, and they come down and Peil Yeshua's Bekerev Ha'aretz. They bring redemptions down here in the depths of this world, so it's appropriate, of course, to reconnect and reappreciate Alter Rebbe's contribution to each of us, and of course in the context of Chassidus Applied, that we would not be able to be sitting here and talking about how to apply these extremely lofty ideas into our practical lives in a relevant way, in a way that gives us the tools to deal with every challenge that we have, as the Alter Rebbe writes in the introduction to Tanya, every challenge, Eitzes v'chol inyonei Avedis Hashem, which really encompasses every challenge that we have. And if we can't find the answer, to go to Gedalim Shabeir, the mature people in the city or in the community, and they should help us understand how to apply these ideas. The connection to Pasha Vaeirah, there are many connections. The Rebbe speaks about Shmois Vaeirah is Golus in a Geula in a way, because Shmois, of course, is the depths of the Golus. Vaeirah is still not the Geula, but it's the beginning because God reveals himself. B'Shem Havaya. Till then it was Kel Shaddai. He revealed himself in somewhat of a limited form to the Ovis, but to Moshe Rabbeinu, he reveals himself Havaya. So in the pain, in the throes, and the pain of Golos, Mitzrayim from the word constraints, that's where you find the greatest revelation of Havaya. Shmi Havaya leina daiti lehem, but to you I will reveal it. And of course, Havaya, in essence, sometimes alludes to that levels of Eir, Etzem Eir, just teaching it today in Ayin Beis, in chapter 340, where he says that Etzem Eir, in a way it's encompassed in the Moir, not Etzem, but Etzem Eir, that's the language of the Rebbe Rashab, that's the level of Havaya, Ani Havaya. So Havaya represents that dimension that the Alter Rebbe revealed, which interestingly comes in the darkness of Golus, as the Rebbe explains in volume 15, Likutei Sichos, and the Sikh of Yutas Kislev. He says that the two reasons why this Gilia Primis HaTeirah, Chassidus, an inner dimension of Torah is revealed in our time. One, and seemingly contradictory reasons. One, because the darkest of times needs a stronger light, as the Alter Rebbe's mashal, that when the child is ill, and pointed that to the ill of being in a coma and death-threatening, life-threatening situation, on his deathbed, so you pour in from the crown of the king, maybe mixed with water, maybe something will drop into between the clenched teeth of the comatose child. So that's a reason for basically dealing with the darkest of times. As I said before, Tinnik Shenishba, that we live in times of, that all of us are in a state of spiritual displacement. On the other hand, it says the reason is because it's like Shabbos, Erev Shabbos, Friday, which is the 6th millennium, it's like Friday, that prepares us for the 7th, for Shabbos, so we taste, we have a taste from the meals, from the foods of Shabbos. What is the food of Shabbos? Primis HaTeirah, Teirasa Shel Mashiach. So what we have is a taste as we get closer to that period in time. But it's not a contradiction because it's interdependent. Because of the deeper darkness, which always precedes the dawn of the Geula, of the dawn of the redemption, that's when you get the deepest revelations. Like Havaya is revealed in Mitzrayim, not to the Ovis, who did not have such a exile to deal with, and such challenges and such slavery and bondage as the Jews did in Mitzrayim. So the Alter Rebbe, coming in the last generations of Golus, of course following the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid, comes to teach us these tremendous the jewel of Torah, the Primis HaTeirah, in order to both give us a taste of what's coming and to deal with the challenges that we have. So it has to deal with those challenges, which means it has to be relevant, or else it defeats the purpose. Okay. With that said, let's get into some topics. In this context, what better way to honor the Alter Rebbe by talking Chassidus applies to our lives. So there's plenty of follow-up, and I'll try to balance it all with some new things, some follow-up, some things we've discussed. But I got this heart-wrenching letter. Of course, this comes in by email anonymously. Not even email. It comes in in our anonymous forum, where you can post any of your questions. It's at meaningfullife.com/MyLife. It's a special place. It's completely anonymous. So I've got one email, but a few emails. So I decided, simply words from the heart enter the heart. It came from the heart, these letters, clearly. So I feel the need to talk about it, even though I have talked about this topic before. And viewer and listener discretion advised. But here's how it was phrased. Hi, Rabbi Jacobson. My friends and I study in yeshiva, name withheld, and enjoy your weekly Chassidus Applied. One Farbrengen a couple of months ago, in the wee hours of the morning, we decided to write to you regarding a delicate topic that a number of us are challenged with. We are 18, 19 years old and all have active hormonal drives. We all struggle to curb the passion and seem to spend inordinate amounts of energy trying to refocus ourselves away from thinking inappropriate thoughts. If I bring, the letter is a little, I made it a little milder, it's a little more explicit, but for obvious reasons, I think everyone understands what I'm talking about. I chose to read it somewhat modified, but nothing changing in the content. In Farbrengens, we have shared with each other our struggles with these desires. And to release our pent-up tensions. It seems many a time we all fail and commit the sin, leaving one feeling temporarily relieved but feeling deeply guilty. Why is the system set up like this? What does God want from a healthy 18-year-old male with raging hormones? Is it possible that we should be getting married now, as some other Chassidic groups do? What advice can you give us? I would say that we are not comfortable bringing this up with our yeshiva Mashpi'im for fear of the repercussions on our potential future shlichus, our standing in yeshiva, our reputations, etc. Thank you so much for your willingness to deal with delicate topics so candidly. Okay. I received another letter after that in a similar vein. I think it's from the same group. Thank you for the wonderful work that you do and continue to do for the world over. Guidance that we crave, cherish, desperately need, and graciously say thank you for. Boys will be boys, and I've always wondered what is really going on behind closed doors. As we grow and mature into full-age teenagers. And he goes on to ask some more explicit questions, which again, as I said, I don't think is appropriate for me to read in detail, because my response will be, regardless, will answer your question. Those that wrote the question understand what they wrote. So I will speak about it, and please give me a straight and honest answer, biblically speaking, not chassidishly. Thank you again, Rabbi. May God bless you 1,000 times for your tremendous leadership. So thank you for all your kind words and vote of confidence, and now I have to try to live up to it, especially in this sensitive topic. So firstly, let me make reference to the topic I addressed, of course, from the early episodes, being such an obvious issue for so many and challenge and struggle. Back in episodes 6, 7, 8, and 9 is when I discussed this at length. So I refer you to there. I probably will be saying some things from what I said there, but let's put it this way, I'm not going to repeat everything I said then, because that's all recorded and archived. You can find that on our website, meaningfullife.com, as I said, /MyLife. meaningfullife.com /MyLife. But let me answer in the context of the way you're asking it, and hopefully also answer questions, similar ones that I've not read, that I've either heard from people who told it to me in person, or over the months have written in different forms and fashions. So I'll try to speak about it, I can't say comprehensively, but hopefully enough to be able to give some empowerment here. Firstly, as it is with everything, from a point of view of Chassidus, we're taught that there's two ways to deal with every issue. There's preemptive and there's remedial. Preemptive, of course, is the healthiest way. In the words of the Alter Rebbe, the Baal HaElula of Dalet Teves, that he says that better than catching a thief and putting him into prison is to rehabilitate him that he shouldn't be a thief in the first place. However, there are situations that once you've already been fallen and there's been already a problem, so obviously you need to have other measures. So preemptive is something I addressed back then. I want to just say a few words about that. And this doesn't answer necessarily these Bochrim's questions, because you're already talking about 18, 19-year-olds, you're in the situation and the challenges, but it's talking about something which is, I think, critical for all of us, especially parents and educators, to hear. To preempt these challenges as best as possible can save so much aggravation, so much hours of pain, loneliness, guilt, and so on, that it's well worth that investment that we all should make, much more than we're making. And that is how we bring up our children from the youngest of age. Remember, our identities, including our sexual identities, and our attitudes to sexuality and everything that will come with it, begins not when you're 15 or 20. It begins from day one. It even begins in the mother's womb. It's an attitude that tells how comfortable you are in your own skin, how you see your own self as a developing human being. Now, when a person sees themselves as Hashem's gift and sent a neshama down to earth with a shlichus, and that's imbued in a person from the youngest of ages, without even necessarily discussing anything explicit about sexuality, that creates a child that is far, far more likely going to be able to handle challenges than someone who's doesn't have such an environment. Not because we've told them something, but it's more than just what you say. Remember, preemptive health, basically a healthy person, is not something about do this, do that. It's a full state of being. It's a lifestyle. It's an attitude about everything. A person who feels bad about themselves, a person who is not comfortable in their own skin, more likely is going to have bigger challenges. It's a pretty natural thing. Parents who are not comfortable with their own selves and their own sexuality, even if they don't say anything, that also rubs off. And of course, doing everything possible to protect our children from any form of violation and abuse, God forbid, which of course is once you start tampering with those wires, who knows what comes from that? We don't even know the extent of the damage done by that and the extent of how prevalent that is. And it's not what I wanted to address here. I wanted to just speak about us doing whatever we can to not have to talk about these things to the extent that we do, because it's preempted. Now, I'm not being naive. I understand that preemptive alone is not going to solve our issues, but it's a tremendous element. And Chassidus talks about this at length without saying as much, how to create, how to develop, how to cultivate healthy attitudes. And I've said a number of times, when you have an healthy attitude to your whole self, your whole being, so then your sexuality as well, when you start becoming aware of the sexual part of a person's personality, the sensual part of their personality, it's all part of the divine plan. It's not some surprise that comes rushing up on you. It's part of God's plan. And when you understand it as such, when it comes that point, that's also part of your sacred body that you're there to protect. There are temptations and challenges. That's what life is about. Like the Rebbe told many times people, don't be in a spol, you have a yetzer hara. Well, that's the way God created it. In Tanya he says that don't get depressed from it. This is the way it was planned. There should be such a battle and struggle. Why am I emphasizing this? Because the elements of guilt, the elements of shame, the elements of embarrassment and the loneliness that comes from that are all demoralizing factors that actually help feed this so-called unspoken impulse. They don't solve anything. On the contrary. So creating a healthy attitude about yourself, which means that even if you do, God forbid, fall, and all of us will have times when we have a setback, don't beat yourself up. Do what you have to do. Pick yourself up. Don't justify. We're not looking to justify. But don't become enamored or completely overwhelmed by the guilt and the curses and so on. Which I also say, though I will talk about this a little later. I'm not here to preach to anybody, especially to Mashpi'im. But unfortunately, many bochrim will say that the problem, that like the fact that it pains me to hear you can't speak to your Mashpi'im about this. Which means you can't speak to someone. That means that there's shame involved. That means there's a stigma, there's taboo. And speaking means you'll be judged, and it can affect your reputation. If a bochur feels that way, what you tell me, what does that say? What's going on there? So we have to, as Mashpi'im, also look at how Chassidus looks at it. When the Rebbe speaks about the issue of hes chadas, people think it just simply means move your mind to something else and focus on something positive. Obviously it means that, but it's much deeper than that. Don't get consumed with your own guilt. Don't get consumed with it, and I'm going to do tshuva, and I'm going to berate myself, and so on, because that alone feeds the monster. So number 1 point is the preemptive as opposed to the remedial. We'll talk about the remedial now. Remedial means once you're dealing with it, I know bochrim, and I myself went through this, that for years didn't have to deal with it because they were very much immersed in learning. And though, of course, everybody has that part of themselves developing, but when you're really busy and you're more or less younger and you're not yet jaded in any way, you could so-called, I don't want to say by time, I'm not sure what the right word for it is, but you're in the waters that are holy and healthy. Most people that have problems earlier on is because something has happened in their lives or because their environment is not that healthy. Now, I'm not suggesting, there are of course situations where a person, just as you say, raging hormones, but it's usually not before bar mitzvah, as the writer writes. So now how do we deal with the remedial? So remedial begins with this. Number 1, again, the attitude about yourself. You need to have someone to speak to who accepts you, who loves you, who cares about you, who is sensitive and is non-judgmental. You can't imagine how far that goes. That's what a true mashpi is. And this is absolutely necessary more than any other area as in these challenges. Because here's where you need someone to come tell you advice on how to daven or how to learn a Chassidus. That's relatively not that, I'm not saying that's not important, but relatively not as sensitive and complicated. But to talk to someone about the darker parts of your life, and not to talk necessarily explicitly. Enough a smart mashpia will understand. And it's absolutely important not to speak explicitly. We're not here to consume ourselves again, immerse ourselves in it. Having someone like that can go a long way because that person helps you understand that you take it easy. You may have made a mistake. Move on. Build up your self-esteem. So number 1 is having that type of attitude. Number 2 is Chassidus Applied. We're Chassidim of the Rebbe. We're Chassidim of the Rabbeim. The story with Kuskusia Lepler, who was in, I think it was him in Peterburg. And he had a yetzer hara, and he had the temptation, whatever it was. And he said to himself, and that's how he stopped himself, Vi pastis for a chassid of the Alter Rebbe to act in such a fashion. That pride is what stopped them from doing it. So it's important, and this is an extension of the self-esteem point that I'm making. It's important to have good self-image. A self-image, and know that you're a chassid, and these challenges are given to you for you to be able to be stronger, to overcome them. Positive attitude like that goes a long way. Is it automatic magic pill? No, absolutely not. But it's a critical component. Then let's go over to the positive attitude. You did something, so find a positive thing to do to counter it. At the end of the day, any sexual force is a form of energy. It's energy. Think about it. It's energy that's very powerful, that's very passionate, that gets your emotions going, some type of deep pleasure connected to it. So the more you can find pleasure in other things that are kosher and holy, as I quoted then, the Sikh of Tafrei Shayin Gimel Yutes Kislev, learning Chassidus with such geschmack, that again, is it a magic pill? We're not looking for magic pills, we're looking for somewhat weakening the drive, somewhat harnessing it. So when a person feels good about themselves, and you have projects you're involved in, and you're volunteering, or you're working in some research, or you're doing something in music, or some area that you have a talent in, there's no question, while you're doing that, you're busy with that and not busy with something else. Is it going to resolve it again? I'm not going to say that will, but the stronger energy you put into one thing, the weaker energy there is elsewhere. You simply can't put energy everywhere. Then there's the Hesach Hadas that the Rebbe talks about, which of course, number one is not to focus on it, but to put your mind into something else, as I just said. But also, as I said, not to focus on the whole negativity. People say, the guilt, they told me shadim are created, demons, and crippled children, and handicapped, and so on. I don't even want to repeat it, but since it's part of the lexicon. So even if these things say, and we have to understand what they mean, because remember, we're talking about spiritual impurities, it's not exactly physical always, and it's that sense of the word, you have to understand it in a more subtle way. Beyond that, this is not the derech of Chassidus Chabad. We don't parkezach and to start talking about all these things which don't have any benefit except for the moment may drive fear of the Lord in someone's heart, but how long does it last? You show me the person that because of that has helped them completely refrain from any of these challenges. The far bigger way is, the greater way is you're such a great person. God blessed you with such a beautiful soul. Sexuality is the power to give birth, the power to create yesh ma'ayin in this world. Don't you want to preserve it for creating true yesh ma'ayin instead of wasting it in some way or scrounging it and other such type of an attitude? But it all has to come from that type of healthy approach where you talk about it with a certain calm, with a certain ease, and not hysterical, and not in any dogmatic way. And let's be honest, this is where Mashpi'im will really be tested. Are you sincere or you're not sincere? You're just saying words, you're not just saying words. Words from the heart enter the heart. So I say to all these bachim that wrote to me, that from my heart I speak to you, that you must have someone to speak to that you can trust. And remember, challenges are challenges. You don't look back, you look ahead. If it bothers you, think in terms of what does it motivate you to become a better chassid, to become a person who can say proudly, I'm the Rebbe's mensch, I'm the Rebbe's soldier, sent to this earth to bring light to the world, and find projects where you can invest your time in. And and God forbid there's a setback, there's a setback, you move on. And finally, I want to say about the issue of age with marriage. So I was looking for it, and I did find, I was shown by some friends, some sources. There is 2 letters with the Rebbe. We have, of course, the custom of Chabad is more, I don't know if it's a custom written anywhere, but before the age 20 years, usually men don't get married. There are exceptions. But at age 22, 23, that's when you start looking. And the Rebbe does have, however, in 2 places, in Igros Kodesh, volume 18, page Tov Lamed Vav, 436, it's a letter based Thomas Tufshin Yotes, and a second letter to Dr. Moshe Monk, Yud Beis Oder Tufshin Chof Aleph. This is a letter, volume 20 in Igros Kodesh, page 175, where the Rebbe speaks about Asvardim, whose custom was to get married younger, that he's shocked and he's the tzadi, my deep pain, that since they started making Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, they've begun to assume a new custom that they should get married later. He says, Halavai Ashkenazim would follow the lead and start getting married younger. and brings the Rab Chizda, the famous words of Rab Chizda in the Gemara Kedushin, Chof Teves Beis, the bottom there of the page, where he talks about the quality that he had because he got married younger. And a similar point that he makes in the other letter that I referred to, though he doesn't say that Halavayit should be that way by Ashkenazim. Now, I'm not here to make Mitzakanuta Konis. I'm just reading from this. But clearly, if a person is in a state where they are really unable to continue learning because they're so distracted by this, yes, it may be something time to start looking into Shidduchim. Obviously, I would not say 16, 17. I'm talking about 18, 19, 20, and so on. But again, case by case, but I just thought it would be appropriate to bring up those letters. The Rechagav, looking at the Gemara Rab Chizda there, Rab Chizda first says that he speaks about the qualities of Rabbi Amnuna Saba and to Rav Huna. And Rav Huna then meets him and says, he saw that his head was uncovered, he wasn't married yet, so he talks about him in a very negative way. Rab Chizda called him Adam Gadol, a great man. And then later it says Rab Chizda himself got married early and see themselves as greatness, which seems to be a little contradictory in the Gemara, just as an aside. But there clearly the Gemara, either way, talks about the virtues of getting married younger. And clearly, because of these reasons, to prevent Nisyanis, even back then, imagine today. Okay. Well, a good segue is to go back into the topic of Tznius, which you can imagine there's been plenty of feedback after the last few episodes about women's hair covering. And I don't want to continue to go into every detail again and again. I think I covered it to some extent. But I will sum up that the different letters, and I could count here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 letters, more than 8, probably 10 letters that I have myself recently received. They basically all are summing them up. What they're addressing, and I can't read them all because of a simple limit of time, is number one, that people want me to comment about the Rebbe, which I did not end up commenting that last episode, not two. Number two, a little more about the hair itself, Tznius in general, our standard of Tznius, and the state of teachers and Mashpi'im, which we'll talk about in a moment. So regarding the Rebbe, since I already brought it up and I read some of the questions, I read some people's thoughts, let me start with this. It's nicht meine Meises and meine Geschäften, what's going on by the Rebbe. That's a Yiddish expression, which means not my business. I did not know the Rebbe, and I did meet her a number of times because I brought Shalach Monis and also a few other things that I brought to the Rebbe's house as a child. But it's not something I can talk about. And with Derech Klal, just like a Rebbe, it says, Ein Reinas HaMelech Keshum Mistaper. You don't look at a melech as he's taking a haircut or doing other personal matters. I would say the same with Amalka, with the queen, Malach HaMaternusa. So what's B'chlal our business looking into what's going on in a realm that we're told not to look at altogether? And why are we told not to look at? Not because there's something inappropriate, because there's a hadras covered. Everybody knows that Rebbe took a haircut. You saw that. One day his hair was longer, then the next day it was shorter. He must have taken a haircut. They knew when the barber went into the Rebbe's room. So why can't you see it? Right? Might as well take a picture and see the Rebbe taking a haircut. Because there's a melech. And a melech, you need to have reimamus, a kovid, just like there's the kovid of Shmiras HaMikdash. There's a dignity and there's an honor. And they had shemrim around the Beis HaMikdash. So Rambam says, what do you need shemrim? Were they afraid of thieves or criminals? No. Because Shmira is a sign of Kedusha. When something is valuable, you protect it. You stand around it. It's a show. You don't leave it alone. Just like you would escort somebody that is respectable. You escort everybody, frankly. So the same thing is there's a certain derech and kovid. So even to go there and parkazich is not my business. It's definitely not the platform of MyLife Chassidus Applied. I don't think the Rebbe would want us to do that. So I'm not interested in doing that. I have no question now that I'm sure the Rebbetzin and the Rebbe live up to their highest standards, including the issues that they themselves spoke about, including issues that are befedish. You have a question, you think that what you saw in a picture. So first of all, how do you know for sure? Maybe what you saw is not accurate. And secondly, as I said, why are we b'chlal going there? What's our business? How does that change the standards that are expected of us? To use that as an excuse and say, oh, I think I saw this and that, and that's why I don't have to live up to the highest standard. Let's be honest, that's childish. We're adults and we have expectations, and there's svarim, and there's halacha, and there's chazayar, and all the codes that we talked about. And the brachas that come from covering the hair, and all the details and all the aspects of it. So that's what I have to say. Whether it satisfies everybody, listen, I'm not going to satisfy everybody, but this is my feeling on the matter, and for me it doesn't really makes absolutely no difference what the Rebbe did or didn't do. And as I said, I'm completely confident that what she did was the right thing and on the highest standard, and that's enough to say about this. Okay. As far as the issue of hair itself, there were some more questions, interesting questions about this. I will use it as one of the, because of the questions, I'll move it over to the Chassidus Question of this week, because there are some issues that some people brought up, which I will address, but more from the Chassidus of it. And there were, and I said, what the interesting thing that did grow out of all of this, that some of you may or may not be aware of, that one of the reasons I did address this issue, because there were different numbers of women that over the months, I should say, over the years since I started my life, that have asked me these questions, and are very dedicated in actually creating a movement and a website which is now being talked about. So I believe we'll post everything on the forum there, more detail, to go through here and use this valuable time to go through every letter and every nuance of exactly when and what and so on. I think it's far more appropriate to create something. So if these discussions spawn such a movement, such a platform where people can contribute, can write, can argue, can discuss, that to me would be the greatest tribute that we're doing the right thing on MyLife Chassidus Applied. I will read one thing here which I think is worthwhile discussing, and then I'll go over to the issue of Tznius. Let me just make sure. Okay. Yeah. So I'm listening to episode 95, one writer writes, of Chassidus Applied. I'm finding the section on hair very interesting. By the way, my sister, who is a sociologist at the University of Arizona, wrote a book called Rapunzel, on feelings of women about their hair. Anyway, I have a very specific question about wigs. Speaking in terms that Rabbi Jacobson uses, we can agree that hair has a great deal of sexual energy attached to it. I understand the idea of keeping that covered in married women, but I understand the logic for why it is seen as not necessary in unmarried women. Although not fully, because it's sexual energy that moves people to marry. So clearly that type of energy exists before marriage, and in fact is very elevated precisely because it is unrelieved or unreleased. I will address this point a little later in the Chassidus Question. Now, the rabbi addressed the fact that often the wig is more attractive than the natural hair itself, that it is not a matter of beauty so much as the energy of the natural hair. But just as when we wear certain clothing, it takes on a power that impacts our behavior, a wig is a part of that clothing. Although the wig is separated from the prior owner of that hair, it still has energy associated with it, far more so than a shirt or a tie. Wigs can definitely be far more beautiful than the woman's natural hair, creating a certain false energy that can be imparted to the wearer of the wig as well as the person viewing the wearer of that wig. So it seems to me that the wig imposes a false energy that may in fact be more intense and inappropriate than if a simple cloth hair covering was used. I would love to hear Rabbi Jacobson's response to this question about the elevated sexual energy of a wig and the false sexual energy of a wig. So you're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct in saying that, and that's why I alluded to it, but now I'll elaborate a little more. There's the issue of the hair, as we spoke about, asar ish be'isha erva, as being sexual energy that needs to be covered, except when a woman is with her husband, and so on. Now, there's another element where we talk about tznius. Tznius, as I said, is modesty at all times, even when you're in the shower, even when you're with your husband, even in a moment of intimacy. Tznius is hatzna lechas im Hashem alekecha. It's a dignity. So obviously that applies in generally how we dress, including a sheitel. The reason a sheitel is not an issue because it's not your natural hair, so the erva thing is for sure not there. But wearing a sheitel that's provocative or promiscuous or suggestive is like wearing clothing that's that way. So of course it goes into that category, regardless whether it's your natural hair or not. And that goes into the whole subject of tznius in general, as I've discussed, the concept of modesty and dignity. So you're absolutely right, there's an energy we give off in our body language. You could also be dressed completely with a very, even not attractive sheitel and not attractive clothing, and also behave in ways that are not appropriate. So there are many ways that a person can behave that are not tzniusdik, that are not dignified, even if, the letter of the law and beyond the letter of the law are followed. There are people that are very, very provocative in their body language, in their eye contact, and other things like that. So tznius is an all-encompassing attitude. To use the words of the Tanya and Perek Memalav, to quote Alter Rebbe again, being that it's his day this week, Chof Dalet Teves. B'chini Hashem nitzav alav v'beichin kloyes v'lev. One of the Yud-based psukim. A person has to feel 24/7 that God is standing over you and watching and looking at you. And not as a principal, an angry God, vindictive, looking to be punitive and so on. A God that is looking, are you living up to my standards? You're my child. You're my soul. Person has that attitude, that's how that should permeate every aspect of what they do, how they dress, how they walk, and how they talk, and how they behave, and how they project. So there's no question. With that, let me go into the segue with the third point, which a few of you have written to me about, the standard of Tznius. Okay, again, this is not a platform. It's not. I'm not one of the rabbis of the community or of any community that is going to talk about now the need for hiring standards of Tznius. Obviously, in the context that I just said, absolutely yes. But let me share with you a story. There was someone that came to the Rebbe, and this happened more than once, and spoke very negatively about what he saw in the community, how people dress. And the Rebbe smiled and said, "You're talking about my children? You're talking about my family?" And the Rebbe was like, so-called, "You're insulting me by talking about them that way." Then when the Chassidus was over, the Rebbe called in the Rav, Mashpi'im, whoever it was, and gave it to him over his head about the standards and what people are saying. Now, why didn't the Rebbe tell that person, "You're right, I'll do something about it"? Because there's two sides here. For us to sit around in a community that is permeated with the Rebbe's years and decades of Vaeirah, and start talking about people Lashon Hara-wise, is not, where did we get that derech from? There are people who came to the Rebbe and spoke about how bochum were sloppy and how bochum were smoking and how bochum were dirty and so on. And always the Rebbe said to them, "You're talking about my children?" And then, privately, this is something between us. So I think, first of all, this whole attitude of becoming witch hunters and lynch mobs, we're going to go on the Tznius police, as some people have coined it, and we're going to eradicate the problem of Tznius, first of all, is not going to work. Nobody responds to lynch mobs. Nobody responds to holier-than-thou attitudes. Number two, since where did we get that derech from? Teach people by example. Teach people by warmth. You see someone that you think needs some encouragement, call them in and talk to them. This type of attitude to start putting labels on people and announcing things, that itself is not tzniusdik. So that's number one I want to say about this. Number two, the whole point of Chassidus is Hatzalachas im Hashem Elokecha. So you can have someone who's focusing on all kinds of certain details that may be important according to halacha, but they themselves are not behaving in a dignified way. Judgmentalism is also not tzniusdik. Condescension is not tzniusdik. Thinking that you're holier than someone is not tzniusdik either. So you're going to expect someone's going to respond to you if you speak that way? So I would step back and let's all look at each other, first of all, in our own hearts and see what's really hurting us, what's bothering us. Then dvarim hayetzim min halev. Find a way. If this is your brother and sister, if these are your own children, you find a way. You do not do it with judgment. You don't do it with anger. You don't do it with hysteria. And say, "Look how bad things are." They're that bad. So figure out, what are we doing wrong that's creating an environment that we cannot communicate to people what we think is supposed to be the highest standards. Maybe the lack of tznius that some people are pointing out, maybe is a symptom, not a cause. What is it a symptom of? So that already is a little too much to go, to a little too touching tender spots. So yes, sometimes you have to look at it as a behavioral thing that's a result of people simply not understanding. Or as I've heard from enough people to say right here without hesitation, that I am this way precisely because I got turned off by the whole shame, guilt attitude that I've discovered is imposing standards that are not necessarily that are not necessarily the only absolute standards. There's different ways to look at things, and so on, which I'll talk about in a moment as well. I see time is limited, so I realize I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but I just wanted to share those words. In that context, okay, I see we're going to have to move some topics to the next week. What can I say? But in that context comes the other point that came across. The people's comments about Mashpi'im and teachers and so on. And here, interestingly, two extremes. From one person I received a letter that you mentioned in one of the past episodes about getting general guidelines about intimacy from a chas and kala teacher, and then tailoring it to fit the couple's personal needs. While I understand your point about it being something that isn't one size fits all, I'm still bothered me the way it was said. It came across as if you can hear and learn one thing and then go on and do something else. As a chassan teacher myself, I felt that to be misleading. Any chassan college teacher knows to not give step-by-step lessons as to exactly what is to be done in the bedroom. It would be impractical as well as inappropriate. However, I do think that it should be emphasized that whatever guidelines are given should be followed to the T, as all of them are coming from clear sources, and is not only no different than any other area of Yiddishkeit and halacha. On the contrary, they are fundamentals of Kedushas Habayis. And should anyone feel they need different guidance or rules for whatever reasons, this should not be done without consulting and understanding Mashpi'im. If topics like this will end up being up for grabs to fit a couple's needs, there's no way to know where one can end up. Thank you for the platform to clarify this important idea. Okay, as usual, I get a letter of the exact opposite. You seem to be avoiding criticizing Mashpi'im and teachers. But between us, we know that some of them are simply incompetent and cause more harm than help. Why not speak openly about this? Okay, so here I am, stuck between the two types of statements. I am not here to endorse or to criticize anybody. And that's absolutely correct. I'm not going to use this platform to criticize even things that I might find deserve criticism. That's not the role of this MyLife Chassidus Applied. We're trying to be positive, we're trying to be constructive for everybody. But I will say, if you look at the psyche Yutas Kis of Tov Shem Lamed Zayin that I've cited a number of times, the source of Mashpi'im, the Rebbe says there, everybody should volunteer to be a Mashpi'im. And we'll see what happens. If people respond to you in a healthy way and everything's working, great. If not, the Chol HaKovid, we're not firing you because we never hired you. It's not a lifetime position, as the Rebbe said that. So the idea that people want to be Mashpi'im and offer themselves is a great tribute to them. However, that doesn't mean everyone's fitting to do the job. Just read that sikh and you'll see. Some people are not sensitive enough. Some people don't get the human condition well, don't understand the nuances. Some people are very knowledgeable, book smart, but they don't have the common sense to know how to approach it. What you described, the two extremes, there's an in-between. Firstly, I want to tell you there are people that tell people step by step and feel that people are like imbeciles, especially young couples, and they just have to be told what to do. And do not speak about the nuances and do not teach them how they should be more tzniusdik. They tell them, do this, and this, and that way you're going to be tzniusdik. Then there are mashpi'im that are very loose and permissive and just say whatever goes, goes. The middle ground is far more complicated. It's to teach people to stand on their own. Remember, a husband and wife have to build a life of their own. No third party is going to do it for them. If there's a third partner, it's God, not the mashpi'im. On the other hand, a good mashpi'im will help people get into that type of state of mind. So I don't want to criticize, but I want to say at the same time, when you're looking for a mashpi'im, find someone that speaks to your heart. Not just an authority. Obviously, you want someone who's knowledgeable, and when you have a question, they don't just tell you this is only one opinion. Maybe it's important to know there are different opinions on matters. That's why I did bring up the topic, as controversial as it was, and as much as different people had different opinions on it, because maybe we do have to understand there are nuances. Overall, there's an attitude, we all understand there's an attitude, and then comes, of course, how we look at each other. Many of us project our own negative image on others. Since I'm a Baal Taiva, and then I indulge, and if I'm given a little opening, I'll indulge. So that way, let's best just close that door and just tell people you're not allowed to do this or that or that. But not everybody necessarily is like you are. So you can't project that. On the other hand, to be completely permissive that there's no rules and no guidelines, we know there are. So I could tell you as a chassan, it was not adequate at all, the people that directed and guided. I sensed it, so I didn't take it that seriously, and it wasn't very positive because I didn't have someone to really speak to be very honest. So, did they have the uvda? That doesn't mean there aren't very good ones out there, good mashpi'im and good teachers. This is a bigger topic. It's hard to talk about, and again, in this limited form, but I think ultimately the proof is in the pudding. If people respond to you in a kind way, and they see that there's someone that they can turn to, instead of just being an authority that barks at them, or let's say not even barks at them, but doesn't have that sensitivity and is just telling them didactically this, that, and that, I think that alone speaks for itself. Because there is a lot of collateral damage, whether we like it or not, by people who've been turned off, not just because of the rules and guidelines and they want to have avde bevkei and nichale. I understand there are people who just want to do what they want, and whatever excuse they'll use. But people who are innocent, entered into very, very, very obedient, and we're looking for the truth, and then we're not necessarily always told the right things, and definitely not the nuances, and cause more pshalom bias problems than it solved. I'm Mashpi'im b'Tev on this matter. What b'Tev means, discussing it in the context that we all have that ability to try to approach it in a tznius way, in a modest way, in a dignified way. At the end of the day, it does come down to you do talk to others as you see yourself. If you see yourself negatively, it's hard to talk to other people very positively. Let's be honest. So, with that said, suffice for now. As a result, because of the elaboration on many of the topics, there's a few things that I promised that I would talk about, and I have to apologize that I'm not going to have to move it to next week. So this is an incentive for you to come to next week's episode. But I will at least talk about the Chassidus Question and then the essays in the last few minutes we have here. As again, the topics that have not been addressed will be addressed in Mitzvah Hashem, please God, next week. Chassidus Question. I was fascinated by your presentation on how Chassidus explains the concept of hair and its implications in our lives. Frankly, this was the first time I ever heard such a cohesive and dignified approach to this important issue, and helped me appreciate why the Rebbe places so much emphasis on shaitels and the blessings they bring. However, in reviewing the sources you cited, I came upon an apparent contradiction. Likutei Levi Yitzchak, Chayesoda, page 39, writes that an unmarried woman's hair leaves room for Yanikas Hachitzenim, which means the gleaning of energy by negative forces. While the Rebbe's Tovshin Yud Zayin letter you cited, from the Igris Kodesh, volume 15, page 415, states that it does not leave such room. Can you please reconcile the two? So yes, indeed, in Likutei Levi Yitzchak there does say that. He talks about it at length. He actually talks about the idea of the dech tichel of the badekanish, which is interesting to bring into this whole picture, because that's, I think, the only place I saw that spiritual significance of when the chosen comes and makes the badekanish of the kala, that he says there, that's the symbolism of the covering of the hair that begins that stage when a woman goes into marriage. And that covering protects from the Yanikas HaChitzenim. Whereas before, there is possibility of Yanikas HaChitzenim, and he elaborates there, a Kabbalah, and in the Parsha there, connected to Chayesora and Gilad, and other things that he addresses in Rebbe Levik's classic style. And the letter of the Rebbe says that's the reason that we don't go by the custom of covering pnuyas, meaning unmarried, before they're married women's hair. So of course, because why? Because it didn't come the klal yanika yet. Since they didn't enter marriage, the sexual energy, so to speak, that can feed the negative forces has not yet been released. So seemingly these two are not consistent. Now, if you look in the Rebbe's Mar Mekamis in that letter, however, he cites, among other things, a maimer in Likutei Torah, Parsha Emer. Very interesting maimer that talks about this issue of here. It's Parsha Emer Likutei Torah, Lamed Beis Amid Aleph. So the maimer is V'nigdashti b'teich b'nei Yisrael, and in chapter 4, he addresses the whole issue of hair. As I said, Sar Reisha Ka'omer Naka, which talks about Atik Yemen, the hair that is on the head. Atik Yemen, just as an aside, the Rebbe Rashab in B'yem Hashmini Atzeres in Eter, and also I believe in Ayin Beis later, in volume 2, also talks that Atik itself is there's no real hair. It's Atik as it relates to Arich, just for the record of those that are interested. And there he goes and asks a question that we see in some places. Here is a place that has room for Yanikas HaChitzenim, and then in other places it speaks about here that does not have that Yanika. And he answers, this seems to be in Tzemach Tzedek's Hagah, the Tzemach Tzedek's gloss on Likutei Torah. He cites a Zeir Hariki and Parsha Vayechi that says there's two levels of hair. That's how he answers it. He says that there's hair L'mayla B'Atzilis, Oz Ein Shum Yanika L'Chitzenim, in Atzilis. There it does not give room for negative. Then there's how Nukve, how Malchus enters Beria, in the world of Klippas, there it could. So it could very well be that I can't say this exact reconciliation between Levi Yitzchak and the Rebbe's letter, but it could very well be that we're talking here in two different levels. That there is the element of you see, Sfardim, for example, had the custom, even though they don't follow it today, in most cases that I know of, that even girls cover their hair. Because to say that hair has no possibility, obviously, as one of the writers wrote earlier, the fact of the matter, this girl is going to get married, And that hair, same hair, will be that hair that will become, and therefore the hair is attractive to the person who becomes a chassid. But to say that it has a power that has to be covered because they could be unique, not that powerful. So what you see here is it's all about relative. As we spoke then, the first time I spoke about it from the Maimorim of Chassidus, that here has all these paradoxes. When you cut it, when you don't cut it, the nazir, the strength of it, because it all comes down to the circumstances. So it could very well be that in certain circumstances, the Rebbe is saying, especially in our day and age, that it doesn't have that level of unique. Rebbe Yitzchak could have been speaking about a different type of level where there was more klippus around, and therefore it has that more challenge of unique. I should add, as a side that may be relevant to this, the Rebbe spoke similarly once about kel kala. We always say kel chosen, but in the last of the seven brachas we say kel chosen v'kel kala mehedi yeshama. That Mashiach comes, it'll also be kel kala. So Chassidus asked the question, and I'll cite exactly in Teira Vayigash, and I believe in Likutei Teira as well. I believe in the Maimer of Lahavin Ina Masois, if I'm not wrong about that, and a few other places. It talks about the idea of kel kala. Now we know kel bi isha erva, just like sar bi isha erva. The voice is erva. So what does that mean? So the Rebbe spoke about this a number of times. Also, that's why we say Shemoneh Esrei silently. There shouldn't be a nikas achitzenim, because Shemoneh Esrei is that level of kel. So you say it b'chashoy. However, when Mashiach comes, it says that we will say it with kel ram. You'll say Shemoneh Esrei b'kel ram. And the Rebbe spoke about this in the Sikh of Yud Shvat Tafshin Chof Hey. Likutei Sikh is volume 21, page 379. He spoke about in the Farbrengen of Pasha Vayigash Tafshin Memvov, with the Shemoneh Esrei b'kel ram, very interesting Sikha. And the 15th of Tafshin Memvov as well, Likutei Sikh is volume 29, page 256. And talks about it, obviously, because when Mashiach comes, there will be Ruach HaTuma Arvim Min HaAretz. We'll no longer have those negative forces, so therefore there's no Yonikas HaChetzenim. So based on that, though it doesn't say it specifically, and it'll be like pre-Chet Tzadas, when they were completely arumim, completely naked. And also, I would add one more sikha, Leil Simchas Teira Tovshin Mem Zayin. So similarly, you can say the same thing with Sar Isha, that when the Osud Lovi. Today, however, we're not in that world, but we are told that we're closer to Mashiach. This doesn't mean that we have any way to be lenient in this matter, but it could very well be that that's why the Rebbe emphasized that girls don't cover, because there's less chitzenim, less power of klippah today. And as we get closer to Mashiach, obviously that will ultimately be eliminated once the Ruach HaTumah, the spirit of the negative impurities, will be removed. Again, I reiterate, this does not mean that we're there yet and that anyone can make any such leniencies. But once you see a letter from that, and where the Rebbe makes that leniency, or we have clear sources for it, that's another story. Okay. Now, let's go over to the essays, and then we shall conclude. So 3 essays. First essay, Developing Trust in Hashem by Michal Lezenik. One World Designs, Miami Beach, age 50. This essay will attempt to explain a concept that is probably not mentioned anywhere in writing. There are some things that sometimes they are not written, but one must read between the lines. In this essay, we will see how one can find an explanation, not in an actual Chassidic discourse or talk, but in the conduct of one of the greatest rabbis that ever lived. Several years ago, a book by the name of The Secret came out and sold millions of copies worldwide. Many people jumped on the bandwagon. The law of attraction. But there's something much earlier. The Chumash talks about the power of positive and negative thinking. Basically, it goes on to speak about how our thoughts shape reality. Not in the physical sense, but especially when you you could think about somebody, you could see they react a certain way. He brings Moshe Rabbeinu, an episode of Moshe Rabbeinu Chumash, where you see that type of effect. And basically, therefore, when a person completely puts their trust in God, so whatever obstacle they face, the fact that they have that calm and serene knowledge that there's no reason to be worried, that alone helps them deal with the issue. And he goes on to bring from different places in Torah the idea of betachin, talks about many books about betachin, but they're books who explain the importance of, they talk about betachin, but a very important aspect is missing in those books. None of them discuss how does one reach this level. And here he brings the Rebbe into the picture, that you see the Rebbe in his attitude in so many different ways, that he taught us how a person should have that type of trust. He brings a mimer from Vaeirah Chof, and basically that the biggest obstacle we have is all doubt. An interesting piece of this essay is also introduce a children's game called Kerplunk, which captures this in a child's game, which is a very creative way of applying this, and then concludes with the key few elements that are necessary: positive language, thinking big, using allowing statements, being nice with people. And these are the attitudes that we learn from the Rebbe in how we project the power of attraction, how we project and affect reality around us. Essay number 2 that I'm going to read today is summarizing Enhancing Your Home with Sacred Stillness, Chaim Karp, age 43, a freelancer in Los Angeles. Here it's a very nicely, warmly written essay about how we imply the concept of build me a mishkan, an edifice to dwell in. What the Rebbe, of course, uses is an inaugural discourse for Basel Legani, build me a sanctuary. He speaks about how as a child he used to have a game with other children where they would play ufruf, where, that people would have, they'd play like being covered up of an ufruf with a talis was a very nurturing type of experience. And using that as an example of how we have to create nurturing environments, because that's how you build a temple. What kind of home should we build knowing that will be in our children's hearts forever? And speaks about in a very nice, that temples can be ornate, austere. Should homes be richly decorated and quiet? And his focus is that no, it should be alive. It should be alive with lebedikait. And brings the mimer from the mimer, shitim shtus, that it should be, the way he puts it this way, he puts it beautifully, he says, that their parents who are so busy, all they want is to have quiet and peace. And they want to keep their house clean and healthy. Families that spend time together create their own brand of mishagas, zaniness and shtus, which creates closeness and identity. Games, creativity, puzzles, dolls, reading stories, singing songs, doing things that are loose, that allow people to feel comfortable, to expand, to spread their wings. That's his essential theme. It's an interesting take on the whole Osel Migdash v'Shachanti b'Seicha. And finally, the third one, finding balance, a contemporary paradigm. Avram Aryeh Trugman, Chodesh, New Horizons in Jewish Experience, New Horizons in Jewish Experience, director, Miro Modi'in in Israel. And he talks about translating the concept of one of the pillars of Chassidic teachings, the need to translate every story into understandable and relevant message. So he wants to show how, in this article, we will take a highly symbolic, Kabbalistic and Chassidic concept regarding cosmology and see how it can be employed to not only understand the human condition, but how to balance the conflicting attractions, forces, and conflicts confronting humanity, especially today in our quickly changing and complex world. He uses the concept of Shviras HaKelim from the Arizal, and how the Rebbe's psyche, Chof Ches Nissen, is the Vaeirah the Teyu and Kelim the Tikkun. Now, in Shviras HaKelim, you have the shattering of the containers, but you have the remains, the shards, that we have to then, ultimately, is to redeem those sparks of light and elevate them and reconstruct them. And he applies that to that whole sikh of how we take Vaeirah the Teyu and Kelim the Tikkun. That on one hand, we need to do things that are beyond our capacity. So when people, for example, say the following terms which express the idea of Shviras HaKelim, I can't handle this, this is too much, I'm freaking out, I need my space, I need to get out of here, the straw that broke the camel's back, I really can't deal with this. That's a form of breaking of the vessels. Another example of too much light is too much divine revelation, of course. But what's the other side of the coin? When there's too much emphasis on materiality and not enough light and purpose in life. People are workaholics. They lose their sense of purpose, boredom, loss of initiative, even forms of addiction, alcoholism, drug abuse, and so on. So he says the combination is how you find the proper balance between the two. And a beautiful model he uses is the ladder of Jacob's ladder, which is Sulam Mutzavat, it's on the ground, grounded, but it reaches into the heavens. And then goes on how Chassidus teaches us to do this through mitzvahs, the world of tikkun, but at the same time to bring in the higher energies, which is ultimately the way we introduce Mashiach into the world. Something higher, but in the containers that can be contained. So with this, we conclude MyLife Chassidus Applied, episode 97. As I said, I will deal with the issues I have not covered and continue some that I have covered further. Always welcoming your questions at meaningfullife.com/MyLife. And everyone have a very blessed week, a week of Chassidische week, taking Shnei Eir of the Alter Rebbe's first name, the two lights of Nigla and Chassidus, and being mamshechit in Zalman, the letters of Lazman, in time and space as we know it. Everyone be blessed.